A young man is found dead inside his bedroom. But did he do it to himself, or was it murder? Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Thomas Burkett. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, hello, my name is Mike. If you're new to the channel, I tell 3 true crime stories a week on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I also tell short form true crime stories where I'm probably more known over on TikTok. I have about 3 million followers over there or so. I post at least 1 or 2 stories every single day over there. The link to that will be up here at some point at the beginning and at the end, and it's also in the link tree in the description of this video below, where you will also find the link to my merch store. We do ship all over this entire world. And then lastly, if there's a case you want me to cover, just email me at makingatruecrimerertwo. That is listed in the description. Just email me the name of the person, where it happened, when it happened, and I'll add it to my list. I have over 5,400 names on that list, so it may be a while before I get to that one because I picked them at random, but I will get to it eventually. But anyway, on to today's case. It's not a cheerful thing. So when I picked this name off the list, I didn't recognize the name. But then when I looked it up, I immediately remembered this case because the things that pop up were this was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. And then for some reason, it just like triggered a memory. For whatever reason, I remember this case being, to me, when I was a kid watching Unsolved Mysteries, I mean, every one of them terrified me, but for some reason, this case really just like scared the crap out of me. And I don't know why this one was so it felt different to me than other ones, but for some reason it did. I think it's because the way the victim was found, it was just such a disturbing image. Thomas Calvin Burkett was born on June 9th, 1970, and he would go by Tommy to everyone in his life, and he was born in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. I believe Tommy was one of 2 kids. He also had a sister. Tommy was described as a good kid growing up. He wasn't perfect like no one is. And I don't know a whole lot about Tommy, but from what I understand, his parents would describe him as just, a good kid growing up. Wasn't perfect, but he was always, for the most part, well behaved, and he did well in school. He was kind of a shy, reserved kid. He didn't really like getting into any kind of altercation. He kind of just tried to avoid anything like that. At the time of this case, he was actually in college at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia, and he was a junior in business and psychology major, and he was just a really smart kid. On November 30th, 1991, Tommy had gone to, a party with some friends, and he was supposed to be home later that night, and he typically would call his parents to say, hey, I'm either going to be running late home or I'm not going to be there tonight. I'm spending the night somewhere. And so that's pretty much exactly what he did. He called his house. He spoke to his dad and he said, hey, I'm staying the night over at this particular house. And then he said he would see his parents the next afternoon. The Burketts lived, in Herndon, Virginia. They lived in this, nice little cul-de-sac, middle-class type neighborhood, quiet. It was a peaceful place. Really, no one ever caused any trouble there. But that day, on December 1st, 1991, they were expecting to see their son Thomas at some point later that afternoon or evening. But from what I understand, he didn't show up to something he was supposed to that afternoon. And so his parents had left the house for some time. At 5:10 p.m. that night, a neighbor to the Burketts had been, crossing across the road to go to another neighbor's house to return something to that neighbor. And when she got across the street, she heard the sound of a car kind of driving, around the neighborhood. And then it got closer and closer, and she saw it. She saw a car driving and in front of the house she was at, and then it parked in front of the Burkett home. And that's when she realized, oh, that's Tommy Burkett's blue Mustang. And she saw someone in the driver's seat, but she really couldn't exactly tell who it was. It was more of just sort of like this shadowy figure inside. The car stopped. Now, the car was also driving around the neighborhood, and it was dark outside at this point with no headlights on. So it was driving around in the dark. And the person didn't get out of the car. And so when this neighbor, basically the other neighbor opened the door, and the two of them were standing outside and looking at Tommy's Mustang with the person sitting inside, but the person just wouldn't move and they wouldn't get out. So the two women finally just went inside the house, and then a little bit later when one of them comes out, there's no one in the driver's seat anymore. 1 hour later, Tommy's parents get home, and when they come inside, they saw his car outside, knew Tommy was there. They call out his name, he doesn't respond. And so the dad goes up the stairs to the bedroom. He walks in, and then he immediately kind of comes out of the room with with Tommy's mom, and he says basically like, don't go in there, I gotta call 911. And so he goes downstairs to the phone to call 911, and his mom just sort of sits out there in front of Tommy's room for like a minute before she decides to go in. Tommy was sitting on the couch in his bedroom. His feet were crisscrossed. He was almost sitting upright, and his arms were kind of like just in this position. And the image I'm showing, by the way, is a recreation. So calm down, YouTube. It is a recreation from Unsolved Mysteries. This is not the actual image. Most of the photos I'm going to be showing of like the crime scene or the case are going to be recreations, because there really isn't much photos online, like actual photos. But his hands were kind of like cupped on his lap, and the gun was just sort of resting at the edge or the end of his fingertips. And his eyes were closed, and he was his head was sort of slouched down. And I think it's that imagery why I was always so scared about this case, because it just looks so unusual for a person either who ended their own life or was murdered. It just looks so strange. I don't know. It's just such an unnerving image. When his mom, Beth, looked down at the gun, she immediately noticed something kind of odd. She could see some of the bullets, the cartridges, in the chamber. And that's because the chamber of the gun, because this was like a revolver, was partially out, meaning the chamber was not clicked in. And the gun can't fire if the chamber is out at all like that. Or the cylinder of the chamber, I'm not sure what it's called. When she looked up and she saw, she looked at his head, it definitely appeared that Tommy had been shot through the mouth. There was a fingertip-sized bullet hole at the base of his skull. What was interesting, that is, based on the position of where the bullet, should have exited through his head, because I think it came at an angle. It should have gone through a window, but it didn't. The bullet was actually straight behind his head. The angle, it didn't make sense. So that immediately raised red flags to her. She also noticed that his right ear was damaged. There was blood coming from it. It appeared that Tommy had been beaten on his head. So police are called, and there's kind of this unusual thing, right? Paramedics arrive, okay, and they go to check on him, and they tell the parents, unfortunately he is deceased. And she said, well, how long has he been that way? And the paramedics said, oh, it's definitely been hours. And then a police officer, the detective, comes into the house. He kind of like rushes into the house, like runs up the stairs, but then he sees Tommy's mom and stops and says, this isn't your fault. You're not to blame. And she's like, I don't know what you mean. And he said, people end their own lives for all sorts of reasons. But here's the thing. The detective hadn't even seen the crime scene yet. He hadn't seen anything. No one had ruled it a suicide or otherwise. And so it was very strange for him to say that. And then, like a little bit later, he comes downstairs and, the mom says, the paramedic said he had been dead for hours. The cop said, no, this just happened. As a matter of fact, he probably did it as you were pulling into the driveway. How would you know that? And that's also when police found or showed the parents this note that was in one of Tommy's pockets, and it had this super scribbled out handwriting on it. Basically just said, I want to be cremated. His mom was like, that's not his handwriting. Initially, Tommy's dad believed Tommy had ended his own life. But his mom, just from the get-go, said, this is no, he didn't do this. He was killed. Somebody murdered him. And that's when, as the days progressed, Tommy's mom noticed some strange things. She noticed what looked like blood spatter on a wall kind of on the staircase. She also noticed some blood spatter at the bottom of the staircase, and I think in one other portion of the house. It was very spotty blood spatter. It wasn't a lot. There were little dots kind of everywhere. And then on the landing of the stairs, there were potted plants that had been smashed as if someone had bumped into them and they fell. And then on Tommy's car, his dad found fresh looking scratches and some recent looking damage on the car, which was strange to him because he had just helped Tommy with the car a day or so before this happened, and there was no damage whatsoever. Tommy loved that car. He treated it like it was his child. And so, where did this damage come from? Police refused to investigate this, at all. They just said, this is suicide, that's it. And case closed. One thing that really sticks out too is they did not check Tommy's palms or his hands for gunshot residue at all. They should have done that just simply as a cursory check. Didn't do it. They also did not interview a single neighbor, just in case, right? That's just your basic duty. Just interview some of the neighbors in the houses nearby if they heard the gunshot or they saw anything strange. Just simply do it. They didn't do it at all. And so Tommy's parents had to go neighbor to neighbor asking questions, and one of the neighbors, or actually a couple neighbors, would say that they saw something very bizarre on that afternoon, early evening. There was a car chase in the neighborhood. Tommy's car was being chased by another vehicle, the sedan type car, and they were going crazy, fast around the neighborhood. And clearly Tommy was being chased and he was trying to get away from this person. This was corroborated by several people. People saw this. And then a few other neighbors saw this sedan just sort of parked. And it was just sitting there with someone in the car, and it was just there for 20 to 30 minutes. And it left just shortly before Tommy's parents got home. And it was across the street from the Burkett house. No one recognized the car. Tom goes to the medical examiners to find out what the autopsy showed. And he wanted to see the autopsy report. He wanted to see photos because he was now becoming unsure that Tommy did this to himself. He now was thinking someone did this to him. And when he walked in, he did see some photos of the autopsy. He saw an image of Tommy's ear completely mangled, not from a gunshot. It showed, he also saw an image of one of those autopsy report images of the skull. And it showed this particular report, it showed damage to his skull, a fracture, as if someone had blunt force traumaed his head. But the autopsy report, the written report, says nothing about the ear, says nothing about the fracture. It just says gunshot wound, basically through his head. Cause of death was gunshot wound, and he did it to himself. And that was it. When Mr. Burkett goes public with this information, the medical examiner denies, saying basically, you're a liar. There was no image like that. There was no skull. And all of a sudden, those things are gone. They're not in the report at all. The police refused to, and there's an image of this officer who was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries who gives me these totally uncanny valley vibes, he's a creepy looking guy, but maybe that's another reason why I'm scared by this case, because this cop looked just frightening. But they refused to investigate this, not even as a courtesy to the parents. They were just sure he did this to himself, and basically told the parents, shut up and move on. One thing that was missing was Tommy's driver's license. And a couple of days after his death, a student from the school he was attending turned his driver's license in. And when the parents, because again, the police would not talk to him, this person, when the parents talked to people at the school, they found out that Tommy had been in a recent altercation with this person. Tommy, I guess, one day had gone to this guy's dorm room and screamed at him, basically, leave me alone, stop doing this stuff to me. Nobody knows what that really means, but all of a sudden the guy in the room comes out and like slams Tommy against the wall and beats him up. And the guy later on admits he did it. He's like, yeah, I beat him up. I punched him. I threw him against the wall. He says he did it. And that's when parents found out that this individual was part of this group of kids who apparently, according to other witnesses at the school, kind of tormented Tommy from time to time. It appeared that Tommy was probably friends with them, and then mixed in with they would torment him and like make his life a living hell. A couple of days before Tommy died, he called his mom in a panic and said, basically, he was crying and screaming. He was upset, like, someone broke into my mailbox and they stole my paycheck. And what if they found out something else? And his mom was like, what do you mean found out something else? And he's like, well, I can't say it. It was weird. Like, what did he mean? What if they found out something else? They found out also that Tommy had withdrew like $20 or something from an ATM like hours before, or I guess the night before his death. And his parents found ATM footage. They saw him getting the money out, and as he backed away, the parents saw the image of two men kind of just behind him. And as he was getting money out, they noticed in the camera that he had looked both directions where the two people were. The parents think it was people from this group of people who was tormenting Tommy. And, they know the names of these kids, but police won't investigate them. They won't even look into them at all. Eventually, Tommy's parents would have his body exhumed. They wanted a second autopsy done. And this new person who was hired by the family basically confirmed what Tommy's dad had seen, that Tommy did have some skull fractures to his head, and he also had some like fresh scratches and bruises to his chest, as if someone had like been attacking him. The autopsy also showed that Tommy had a broken jaw, not from a gunshot wound, because where the bullet had entered and gone through, it didn't come into contact with his jaw, but his jaw had been broken. But again, none of that was ever listed on the initial autopsy report. Just gunshot wound to the head, that was his cause of death, and he did it to himself. The students' names were eventually kind of revealed, the ones who had been tormenting him, and they were Philip Howley and Donald McEwen. And people could corroborate that these kids had been harassing Tommy. And there then became this speculation that these two, with this group, were likely involved in the drug world. And so, what Tommy's parents would learn from basically other people, informants and whatnot, was that Tommy, I guess, had become an informant for the DEA. And so what they surmised was Tommy had likely found out about whatever these kids were doing in the drug world. They were dealing, perhaps, hard drugs. And so maybe they found out he was this informant, and then they had to kill him. And that's why he told his mom, basically, what if they found out something else when they broke into his mailbox? Now, the DEA denies he was an informant. They've said, nope, wasn't an informant. The police are like, that's insane. He wasn't an informant. The person who initially told them about Tommy working for the DEA also stated that Tommy was actually beaten to death with a baseball bat. And that's why there was blood spatter on the walls. The baseball bat was actually still at the house. And the thing that the parents noticed when they found out that the bat may have been used was that there had once been grip tape around the handle of the bat. And when the parents found the bat in the house, well after the fact, there was no more grip tape on it. It was gone. Was that because it had fingerprints on it and someone decided to take that off to hide those prints? By the way, the blood spatter found in the house, the parents never cleaned it off the wall. And they had an expert come out, and the expert confirmed, yep, there was little spots of blood in various places around the house that they confirmed was blood, but the stains were so small at the time that they were not ever able to identify it as Tommy's blood or anyone's blood. But they confirmed it was blood. The police said, no, it wasn't. It's not blood. The police have never collected the blood. The person who did it was like a hired expert by the parents. Where is those samples now? I'm not sure. I don't know. The police denied the blood ever existed, even though you have someone who says, yes, it did. There's this belief that this whole informant thing, the police were somehow probably involved, and that the police may have had something to do with covering up the murder of Thomas Burkett. Not that they committed it, but that they, for some reason, had to cover it up. Were they protecting this group of kids who was involved in drug trade? It's not completely out of the question. These things have happened before, where the police have been involved in this. But the discrepancies of like the paramedic saying, nah, he's been dead for hours, to the police officer who's not a trained expert in this saying, no, he just died before you guys walked in the house. It just happened. And their flippant and nonchalant attitude about, just leave it, does he commit suicide? Leave it be, it's done. It's done, that's all it is. And their stubborn refusal to investigate any aspect of this. They, did not take gunshot residue from his hand. I forgot to mention, the autopsy report from that the Burketts hired after the fact, when the body was exhumed, they found there was no, I guess, stippling or gunshot, whatever stuff in Tommy's mouth at all. And it would have still been there even after being, buried. That there would have been that, gun smoke or whatever the hell it's called, went off in his mouth. Nothing was present in his mouth. The police were like, that's not that uncommon, it happens. And then also the angle of the gunshot wound. Who knows how Tommy was sitting when he shot himself, right? Just because it was found in a strange location where it should have been in a different area, we don't know. Tommy may have been sitting in a different position and shot himself, and his body just sort of fell in that very strange position. They are so adamant about not wanting to investigate this. It's insane. And that's where it stands. They ruled his death a suicide. They never investigated it as a murder. They never investigated anything. They never interviewed anyone. Well, they eventually interviewed the neighbors after the parents insisted that they did. And they were like, the neighbor stories are just, doesn't prove anything. A chase throughout the neighborhood? Whatever. It doesn't mean anything. Bitch, what? Yes, it does. Like, it's so frustrating that they just, you could at least do the bare minimum just to find out, right? Wouldn't you want to catch a murderer if there was one? Why would you want to let that person run around potentially to kill someone else? Why? Maybe because the police were working with that person, huh? Maybe. Theory. But that's where it stands today. Nobody has ever investigated this officially. Nobody has ever been arrested or charged. Nobody has ever been brought in for questioning. The police say this is a suicide. That's it. Leave it be. Tommy's parents believe otherwise. Unfortunately, Tommy's mom died of cancer in 2003. His dad died in 2006. Both of them died believing their son was murdered. Both of them died with the police refusing to help them. And both of them died never knowing what happened truly to their son. Personally, I think there is just way too much bizarreness to this case to think it is something as simple as a suicide. I think this has always, now that I remember the case when I first looked it up again, this has always seemed like a murder to me. Always. It's just, to me, it seems obvious. Maybe to you guys it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe there's going to be a differing of opinions on this. And that's okay. But to me, it looks like a murder. Sounds like a murder. It should have at least been investigated just as a courtesy. And at this point, it really doesn't sound like Thomas Burkett, if he was murdered, it doesn't sound like he is ever going to get the justice he rightfully deserves. But unfortunately, that is the end of this case, True Crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, please subscribe, give this video a like, follow me over on TikTok. I sell merch, recommend a case to my email address, but that's it. That is it for this video. So before I do my thing, let me jack it off real quick. Wait, let me take my jacket off real quick. I didn't mean what I said. I'm wearing a jacket, so I wanted to take it off, is what I should have phrased it that way, but I said it the wrong way. So that was very, I'm going to get letters for that. It's hot now, so I'm going to take my jacket off. Oh my God, I'm going to get canceled now. Okay, anyway.